setup. If there are comments that you want to make, I'll turn up the volume. I think people will hear. It's going to be harder for you to hear comments that other people make, so I'll just repeat those. But welcome. Most of you are here for the first session, but not everybody. And so for those who weren't, and also as a little bit of a quick review for people who were, just sort of kind of want to remind us and get our heads back around sort of some of the concepts that were forming the base of what it was that we were talking about when we were thinking about sort of this mystical ancient approach that the rabbis had to thinking about letters. And the core was that the world is made up of letters, right? The world is made through words. The world is spoken into being by God. Words, of course, are made up of letters. And so the world is made up of letters. They're all around us and we can't see them. We can't sense them. I'd sort of used an analogy just because it was one that to me jumps out. It's sort of the Matrix where, people sort of see images and people see whatever, but the movie, but that they're actually in reality just sort of all these letters of code and characters that are streaming by. And when I say streaming by, that's actually a good analogy because these letters are not static. They're dynamic. They're constantly sort of flowing and combining and recombining in ways that help sort of create new things and create new realities and create new possibilities. And in that sense, it's not actually such a different vision, a different understanding of the world, although obviously coming from a very different place. The way that a particle physicist might describe the world. We look around, we see people, we see a room, we see tables, we see sort of all of these things, and we think we know what we're seeing, and a particle physicist would say, yes, you think you know what you're seeing, but you're not. The table is not some kind of solid, fixed thing, even though it feels like it. What is it? It's actually made up of tiny little atoms. And what are atoms? Atoms are these tiny little particles made up of even tinier particles that are constantly whizzing around each other at unimaginable speeds. And the vast majority of them are empty space. The vast majority, are air. So, there's the idea that this table, right, is not solid, but is actually this assemblage of tiny whizzing things that are almost entirely empty space. When you hear that, that's bizarre. That's crazy. This person is clearly off their rocker if they're trying to describe things this way. So it's not our experience, but the particle physicist is sort of going down and trying to understand how reality functions at its deep level, sort of what those core building blocks of reality. Even though it's not sort of operating at a level that's beyond our everyday understanding and perception. And that's what the rabbis were doing as well. It's just that instead of seeing, right, the world as being built of atoms, talked about sort of the 98 different elements that are combined and recombined endlessly in order to be able to make everything in existence. Sounds crazy, except we all learned it in 9th grade, so we're all used to it, right? That everything is made up of 22 different letters that are sort of those core building blocks that are combined and recombined, and just like the atoms. And I will just say, it blows me away the fact that you can kind of make this comparison between a framework that the rabbis sketched out in the 2nd century and that particle physicists sketched out in the 20th century, that sort of the analogies hold up so well, because it really sort of was this incredible act of creativity for the rabbis to be able to think of things in this way. And so just like those particles are constantly flowing and are, are moving and dynamic in relation to each other, all of those same things could be said for the letters, especially the idea that those letters, right, are actually not just sort of flowing completely randomly, but right, they come from, according to this approach, right, their divine source. What are the letters? They are kind of little vessels, little vehicles for containing divine light and divine energy. And they're whizzing around and they're doing their different letter thing, but they're constantly sort of in relation to and being pulled toward and trying to get back to their divine source. So it's almost like sort of all of these different individual letters are coming back. And I say individual letters. One of the things I didn't say last week is, although there are 22 different letters, Sefer HaYetzirah, which is a book that I mentioned last week, from the 2nd century, that means the book of formation, essentially, says that these 22 letters, although there are 22 separate letters, are not actually really 22 separate letters. They're like 22 different manifestations of like this one integrated whole. So, I think a good way to think about it is if you look at a fire, right, and you see all these separate little tongues of flame, and all of these different flames are separate and individual up at the top. But if you look at them, obviously, they're all connected down at the bottom. They're all part of one whole, but they've all sort of got these different manifestations which flare into existence for a moment and then sort of come back down, and things combine and recombine. And that's kind of the way that Sefer HaYetzirah thinks about the alphabet. So we're talking about letters, but really we're talking about the alphabet, right? And so sort of the letters are kind of these separate manifestations of separate sort of expressions of this larger thing called the alphabet, which is kind of this unified whole. So again, we're talking about the letters individually, and we're sort of discussing them individually. But at some level, this approach is saying the letters don't really have their own individual independent existence. Not necessarily unlike, by the way, a mystic might talk about human beings, right? The idea that I am separate from Mark, is separate from Stacy, is separate from Phyllis, right? Well, sure. We look different and we seem to have our own individual existence, but actually no. On some deeper cosmic level, we're all rooted in some whole. Another good analogy for this is the ocean, right? We look at the waves and they look like independent waves and they look like their own separate things, but really there's no such thing as waves. There's water. And then what there is there's energy that moves through the water. And as the energy moves through the water, it sort of shows up as a wave for a moment, but then it all collapses back into the whole. So I'm mentioning all of this because it's a very different way than we're used to thinking about things. It's a very different mindset. Again, we're practical people. We see the world in front of us. We see people, we see tables, we see whatever. We're very concrete and very literal. And that's why this whole class is a little bit of an exercise in stepping outside of that and trying to think about this world. So I called it the mystical Hebrew alphabet, because again, it's not sort of the level of reality that we deal with on a day-to-day level. It's certainly not the level of reality that's going to help us get our turkey cooked or our pies out of the oven on time, but trying to sort of understand and describe what is going on at a little bit of a deeper level. So that's all by way of recap from last week. And I wanted to ask before I go on sort of any questions, and I know it's a very, very quick recap for those who weren't here last week, but any comments or any questions up to this point about any of the things that I've said? Again, this should hopefully be repeat. Okay, good. And we also talked about the fact that a little bit of an extension of this approach can be seen in the idea, we're familiar with the idea that, if you have a Torah and one of the letters is smudged or one of the letters is incorrectly formed, the whole Torah is treif. The whole Torah is not kosher and fit for use until it's been repaired. And we're familiar with the concept, and it also sounds a little crazy because, I'm reading all the way in the book of Exodus, and so there's some, letter that's smudged a little bit in the book of Numbers, nowhere near where I'm reading. Why should that in any way present a problem? Certainly not presenting a difficulty with my ability to be able to read the text that's in front of me, but that's only because I'm making the conceptual mistake of thinking of the text in front of me as somehow disconnected from and separate from that text over in Numbers, just because it happens to be however many dozens of columns over in the Torah, right? The Torah, according to this approach, is one integrated, seamless whole. So if there's a problem in one place, in one part of it, there's a problem in any part of it. They use the analogy of our genes, of our DNA, right? We know you have one tiny little segment of something where there's some kind of mistake in the replication and things being, sort of copied over and transmitted. And you say it's just this tiny little thing on chromosome, whatever, and who cares? It doesn't affect the whole thing, but it does. And we know that one tiny little mistake can end up having a huge effect on a human being. It actually can keep life from being viable depending on where it is. And so there's a section in the Talmud that says if a sofer, Torah scribe, is writing a Torah and he messes up a single letter, he can destroy the world. Which is interesting because the Talmud, that's all it says in the Talmud, and it doesn't explain what it means. And you could understand it on a couple of different levels. You could understand it on sort of the level of meaning, right? If the scribe writes some letter wrong, right? Maybe it leads to a word turning into a different word or looking like a different word that then leads to some interpretation that leads to some kind of theological error, and we, completely misunderstand what it is, right? So destroys the world in that sense, right? That it can lead us into error and mistaken belief and actions. But we could also understand it in this kind of more mystical sense of the, of like when the scribe is writing the Torah, what is he doing or what is she doing? Traditionally he, but now we have a number of soferets, of female scribes as well. It's not that just they're like doing the mechanics of whatever, because if you were doing the mechanics of just trying to like get the shapes down, then a Torah could be printed. You could have a printed Torah and that would be kosher, but it's not, right? A Torah has to be handwritten, and there's some interesting stuff to be said, which maybe we'll touch on next week or something, about the nature of transmission and how that ends up affecting the authority of transmission. But you can print the words of a Torah and you've got the same words, but it doesn't have anything like the same status as a Torah. A Torah, in order to be kosher, has to be handwritten. So it's almost like we're imagining the scribe taking all of these sort of channels of divine energy and writing them and harnessing them. And if you get them all right, then you've created this world. But if you get them wrong, if you mess them up, then you're destroying the world. There's a story which might be familiar to some of you. It's in the traditional Yom Kippur martyrology service. If any of you sat through that as a child and talked about sort of the 10 rabbis who were martyred by the Roman authorities as part of, we don't really have time for that in our service as much. Okay. I've sometimes integrated into the Yizkor service, which is actually can be a moving thing to do. And there's a well-known story in there in the course of these 10 martyred rabbis of Hananiah ben Thradion. This is also brought in the Talmud, right? Who's wrapped in a Torah scroll, and then he's set on fire with the scroll. And as he's writhing in agony, unimaginably, but the way the story, which is clearly not entirely accurate, is describes, his students call out to them like, "Rabbi, what do you see?" And he said, I see the letters jumping off of the scroll and returning to their divine source, which is actually a really, really, really powerful story to think of in the context. It's all right. It's like the Torah, like all of us, have its physical manifestation. It's made of parchment, it's made of ink, it's made of whatever, but the letters are somehow more than something physical, right? They have their own independent existence, right? We talked about the fact that Hebrew is not like other languages that are sort of other alphabets that are created by people as some kind of tool in order to be able to, right, express sounds in symbols so that speech can be written down and expressed and communicated in written form. but that the letters are actually were ordained and created by God and have their own independent existence. So it's like this idea that even when the letters are in a scroll, they're still connected to their divine source, and they're not sort of purely of this world. And so when the physical form of the Torah was destroyed, right, the letters weren't destroyed any more than when a physical body is destroyed. The soul isn't destroyed. There's this part of us, which is more than what is purely physical and is what is rooted in God and connected to God and can't be destroyed. So it's almost like the letters are the soul of the Torah. So when we think about it through that lens, it sort of matches up. I hope all of this kind of helps flesh out a little bit of a picture of the way that the rabbis ended up relating to the letters and the alphabet and how that functions, right? Yes, good. Again, either everybody's completely confused and checked out, or this all makes perfect sense. So you're all just, yeah, okay, I get it. In which case, like, give yourselves a hand, because right. So what Mark is saying is, according to traditional, right, interpretation, right, it's not just that God sort of gave some kind of general guidelines or whatever to Moses, who kind of wrote them down in his own thoughts and his own whatever, but sure, absolutely, traditionally, right, every single word, and in fact, every single letter, right, is transmitted directly by God to Moses, because again, all of those, right, according to this framework they just laid out, 100% indispensable, right? If you make a mistake, if you leave out a vav, which is something we'll talk about in a few minutes or something like that, you've actually completely messed things up. And by the way, there's a very powerful, this is another one of those little sort of mind-bending midrashim, when you talk about sort of the letters that talks about the two sets of the 10 commandments, right? There's the first set of the 10 commandments that Moses receives on Mount Sinai from God. And then there's the second set, which after Moses smashes that first set, right? And then Moses goes, and what's the difference between those two sets? Well, it's not about the content. It's about the way that they're fashioned. We're told that Moses actually sort of carves the words of the commandments into that second set. The first set, the book of Exodus tells us, are written be'etzba Elohim, with the finger of God, right? God's self carved out those letters in the first set of tablets. And one of the things the rabbis say, and I love the idea, I love picturing this, is the way they describe it, right? If we think about sort of if you think about a tablet of stone and you think about sort of letters being carved into it, the rabbis say the letters weren't just carved into it, they went all the way through. It wasn't just sort of, am I describing this clearly? Right, they weren't just sort of carved out a little bit, but they were all sort of stone that was a little bit deeper, but they were carved all the way through. So like if you held it up to light, the light would shine through. You could see it all the way, except if you turned it around, it was forward on the other side as well, which of course is an impossibility. You can imagine MC Escher trying to come up with something like this. It's an impossibility, right? Which is a way of saying that God's writing in a way that God deals with letters, which is to say the way that God deals with reality, doesn't exactly match up with the laws and the rules that we have in the way that things are supposed to work. So again, all of this is trying to kind of sketch out this whole approach to what reality is and how human beings function and how God functions, and that's different from the way that we think about it. Okay, we're good? Again, either you guys are really smart or you had some really interesting brownies before you got here, because you all seem clicked into this. So good. So we had talked about some specific letters. We talked last week just to sort of start taking this and making this hopefully a little bit less, abstract, because we were just sort of letters. Well, let's talk about some letters. So we talked about the Aleph, which we'll come back to in a few minutes. And we talked about the Hey. That's actually all we got to because you guys had amazing things to say. We were, hey, for those of you on Zoom. We were supposed to get a little bit further, but again, you guys had such good comments. So we didn't even get to talk about yud. Yeah. All right. So I don't want to just keep holding this here for whatever. Hopefully we can picture a yud. So quickly, actually, because we did this with the Aleph and the Hey. Just looking at the yud. Let's say we don't know a single thing about the letter yud. What is this shape? What is this symbol kind of saying to us, if anything? What are we seeing when we're seeing this yud?
Oh, could be.
It's floating, says Roger. Right. So it's true, right?
What?
Sorry, Roger said it's floating, which is true. Like we've got this big white space and we've got this tiny little letter. And in fact, if we had sort of it were lined up among other letters, they would all sort of be touching the ground, as it were, right? The base of the line, but not the yud. The yud seems to be floating in midair. It's kind of like so small. It's almost like it's like, you know, a hot air balloon ready to take off and float away.
I see. I was going to. I see movement. It's a moving object. And you say
Okay.
floating. I see it as moving forward.
Moving forward. Okay, I love it. Right. But yeah, you sort of have this sort of smaller part, and then you have all of this kind of this bigger bulk of it that's moving in this direction. Terrific. Thank you, Janet. You have something?
It seemed to me like it was sort of like flying away, and maybe because it's so much smaller than the others and kind of like up there that it seems like it's less significant.
Less significant. So that's interesting, right? It's definitely smaller. We can say that. It's definitely floating. We can say that. And then, so those are objective statements. And then subjectively, does that mean it's less significant? Or does it mean potentially in some ways that, excuse me, that it's more significant, right? So from a spiritual point of view, you know, and from a mystical point of view, the fact that it's kind of so small and almost ethereal, like it's almost floating away, reinforces the fact that it's not quite in this world, right? It's not, it's got this otherworldly quality to it. And we actually had talked about last week about how the hay, right, is made up of a dalet and a yud. And by the way, the reason somebody said it looked like a resh, and it's true, it looks like a resh. And the reason it looks like a resh is because I drew it wrong. I went back and I looked and I realized that when the way a hay is written in the Torah, this really does look, it's identical to a dalet. I should have gone back and filled this back in. It's identical to a dalet, you know, with then this extra little piece in it. And so of course it looks like a resh because I drew it wrong, but take my word for it that it's written in the Torah, this part identically to a dalet. And we talked about how the hay kind of represents, we talked about how the dalet represents sort of the physicality of the world, the horizontal and the physical, the 4 cubits, the dalet amot. And so the hay represents olam hazeh, this world, and the yud represents olam haba, the world to come, right? Because it's got this kind of ethereal, otherworldly quality. You know, when I look at this tiny little letter and I think about it in the context of, you know, this analogy that I've made in setting up about elements, right? To me, yud is hydrogen, right? Hydrogen is like the very first element. It's right. It's a one atom. It's tiny and it's getting ready to, like, you know, just float away. And it's, you know, and it's combustible. So it's almost like this yud is, and that's kind of why I like the idea of, again, now you don't put hydrogen in a balloon, you'd put helium in a balloon because hydrogen is a little bit too dangerous. But, you know, that helium balloon is constantly tugging, trying to float away, trying to get back, right? So yud, you know, has this sense of being, we talked about how you could break up the aleph into a vav, into yuds. We talked about how hay could be broken down into a dalet and a yud. Yud is like this tiny irreducible thing. It's like this tiniest, smallest particle that can't be divided into any component parts. So it's like God in that sense. And of course, the way that we write God in a prayer book or something, is Yud Yud, right? So that idea of, indivisible and here, but constantly pulling out and connected to some otherworldliness, that's the Yud. And so, of course, that's something which is connected to God. Stacey, did you have something to say? Yeah. Well, the way I drew it, again, what I'm trying to do is draw them kind of the way that they're supposed to appear in the Torah, which is sort of the forms that, that, because obviously, you could have 30 different Hebrew fonts with 30 different styles and how they would ever. So sort of the Platonic form, as it were, of the letters of how they're supposed to be, or sort of the way that they're written in the Torah. And there is a sense that the Yud, it's not quite straight, right? It's curving down a little bit. Right. I feel like I need help to understand what you're saying. Hold on, guys. I'm doing. Yeah. What I'll say, Stacey, before you disappear out of the room, what I'll say is just the idea that it's kind of sort of bent down a little bit is supposed to actually represent the idea connected to this idea of sort of, olam haba and the world to come and this otherworldliness, that there's this humility, right? That it's not those who are arrogant and stiff-necked who stick their necks up and whatever and puff themselves up who are going to be the one who are going to receive life in the world to come. It's humility. So it's this small little letter that's kind of bent down, and that's supposed to be a little bit of a little stooped and a little whatever, is supposed to be this kind of indication that these are the qualities that are connected to Olam Haba, this kind of modesty and humility. All right, are you going to go grab a book from somewhere? My office is open, is unlocked. You can go into, you gotta, okay, yeah, Roger.
Think about words.
Okay. Somebody left that there, that's not so good.
Think about words that start with you.
Yeah.
Yod.
So Roger's going to words that start with yod, like yad, okay? And?
You say that the yod can symbolically represent God.
Yeah.
Then talking about the hand of God.
Yod representing God and the yod. Okay.
Small, it has power to it to do things. Useful.
I like that. So Roger said yod, begins the word yad, which is connected to the word yod, which means hand. So maybe that thing that has power that's able to do things. Most significantly, in some way, the thing that yod begins in this context is Israel, right? Is Israel. And so for the rabbis, the fact that yod begins God's name and also begins Israel's name, right? Shows the way that those two things are connected at a very deep level. And what is that deep level? That deep level is this idea of something that's not really rooted wholly in this world. Right? Remember what we said about the Aleph, how it's made up of an upper, wow, this is working so well. The Aleph is made up of an upper yod, which is the divine yod, and the lower yod, which is the lower yod, which is either human Yud or maybe the Yud of Yisrael, right? And so that Yud is connected to its upper source and is trying to get back to it and trying to strive and emulate it. So this idea of something which is not rooted wholly in this world, by the way, another example of that, which becomes important for the rabbis, for the Yud, is Yerushalayim, Jerusalem, right? And there's this idea, just like we talk about Olam Hazeh, this world, and Olam Haba, the world to come, that there's a Yerushalayim Shel Mata and Yerushalayim Shel Mala. There's a earthly Jerusalem and there's a heavenly Jerusalem. And the earthly Jerusalem is just kind of pale reflection of and is connected to the upper Jerusalem. So Jerusalem kind of exists as this concept and this ideal. And then the city Jerusalem is kind of a physical, imperfect, geographical reflection of that idea of Jerusalem. So again, just like you've got the Yisrael, the lower Yud of Yisrael reflecting the upper Yud of Adonai. So you have the lower Yud of Yerushalayim reflecting the upper Yud of the Yerushalayim Shel Mala. So I just want you to see the way Yud keeps filling in this idea of sort of this ethereal floating off because you're not quite fully in this world, and signifying that kind of Olam Haba, that world to come, that irreducibility, sort of all of these things that might be associated with God. And of course, we have, the Yud Yud as a way that we write God's name, or if you have the fuller form Yud Hey Vav Hey, either way, you're beginning with the Yud. Yes, Laura. Yes. Yes. So Laura's asking about the thorn, the kots of the so there are a couple of different things that end up ornamenting letters. There's little the kots, the yod, and then there are also some letters have crowns as well. Shin, Ayin, Tet, Nun, Gimel, Tzadi, and another letter that I'm not remembering. Not remembering, maybe Zion. Zion. That get crowns as well. And then sort of what the question is, what do we do with the ornamentation? Are they just ornamentation? So Rabbi Akiva says you can actually drash and create meanings out of each of the letters in each of the crowns. We talked a little bit about how maybe the Aleph is, if the Aleph is the energy because it's no sound that exists. I'm not going to figure out how to get this thing to stand up before I'll sound right, that it sort of flows from that initial spot. So you do have those on some of the letters, but yeah. Every sign. The three. We'll talk more about that next time, I think. We'll talk more about the counts next time. Yeah, Matt. Yeah.
When you first went through the Aleph, you were with the Mohammed Sistine Chapel and Adam touching.
Oh, nice.
And Yad and Yad.
Oh, I like that. I like that. Matt was saying that when I talked about when we talked about the upper Yud and the lower Yud, sort of, connecting here through that Vav, which is actually the next letter we're going to talk about in just a moment, that reminded him of the Sistine Chapel, right, of God and Adam sort of just touching those fingers, and then of course, right, Yud and Yad and hands. I love that. Okay, anything else we got about the Yud? All right, we got just a couple more letters. We're gonna, we could in theory do all of the letters, but I think that would get a little old. And I wanted to focus on a couple of specific and especially significant letters, just to kind of get us thinking about this way. So if we say that God's name is Yud Hey Vav Hey, or at least one of God's names, we've talked about the Yud, we've talked about the Hey. So the last letter that we've got, and here is the Vav, right? It's the last letter that we've got, like all of the letters in God's name, right? It's got sort of doesn't have a strong sound. It's not one of those b, k, whatever letters. There's sort of all of these sounds that kind of flow. What can we say about the Vav? Yeah.
To me, it looks like a good
Yes.
with, tail to it, rooted where the good floated, and this one is more solid.
So what Roger said for those on Zoom is it looks like a yud, which is true, right? If we sort of stopped it here, excuse me, if we stopped it here, we'd have a yud, but it continues on. So it's a little bit more grounded. Clearly it is, right? It's not, doesn't have that floating quality. It's worth pointing out that for a sofer, for a scribe, the vav is the most treacherous letter. Why is the vav the most treacherous letter? Not because it's the hardest to write. There are letters that are a lot harder to write than vavs. But the problem is it's so close to being other letters, right? If you write the vav with the tail too short, it's a yud. If you write it too long, it's a nun sofit. If you write the top too long, it's a resh. And if you write the top too long and the bottom too long, it's a chaf sofit, right? This is a real problem. And I'll share a story just because this is taking us away from books, but I have to share this story because I don't know, because I love it and because it's so connected to, I think, what this is about. So when I was living in Israel in 2010, 2011, I spent the year studying Sofrut, spent the year studying, with a trained scribe about how to write. And again, and that's not just the mechanics of the writing, it's also sort of about, I mean, some of the material that I have here about the letters comes from that time and what I learned from, I learned from my teacher. And toward the end of my time, or not toward the end, because it took longer, I decided I was going to write my own mezuzah, which was really, 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 really hard. In part because when you write a mezuzah, every single letter has to be written properly in order, right? You can't just, unlike a Torah, which in theory, by the way, you could write every single Aleph, all the Alephs in the Torah, and then you could go back and you could write every single bet. Like the Torah doesn't need to be written in order. A mezuzah needs to be written in order, every single letter properly, if you make a mistake, you have to, like, if I realize I made a mistake 3 letters ago, I actually have to erase the 2 letters that follow to go back and then erase. When I say erase, what you're doing is you're using sort of a sharp blade to scrape off upper level of the parchment in order to be able to, get a sort of a clearer piece of parchment to go back and rewrite it. So you have to erase back to the spot. And you can't, of course, erase God's name. So if you wrote God's name and then you realize there's a mistake past that, then the mezuzah is no good. The scroll is no good because you can't erase God's name, right? So you have to get everything right. You have to get everything in order. As a parenthetical note, mezuzot come in different sizes. I went with him to the special workshop in the old city where you can buy, materials for a scribe and whatever else. And they come in different size scrolls for go in different sizes of mezuzah. As a general rule, the smaller the scroll is, the more expensive it is because it's more work for the sofer to. I made my mezuzah on a 15 by 15 centimeter piece of parchment, which is the biggest one that they will sell because, I wasn't very good at this. And it took me a long time. It took me many months, sort of painstakingly working on this mezuzah in order to be able to get it right. So I finished this mezuzah and I take it to my teacher and he looks at it. And he says, there's this letter that I'm actually not sure is right. There's this letter that might be a problem. And I want you to go and take it to this other scribe to take a look at that letter and see if that letter is a problem. If the letter's a problem, the mezuzah is no good. So I go and I take my letter to this other scribe to show it to him. And he sort of takes a quick glance and it says, that letter's fine. that letter that, that my teacher was concerned about is fine. But this letter is a problem. And what the letter, by the way, that was a problem, it was exactly this. It was a half socket. It might have been Bashoch Bacha, or one of those, there's sort of all of those half sockets in the Via Hafta, right? Right. I wrote this half, Sofit, but it might have been a little too short, which makes it a resh, right? If it's not quite long enough, it's a resh. And if it's a resh, the whole thing is no good because I've got a mistake in there and it's early on and there's God's name afterwards. So there's no way I can erase it. The whole thing is no good. So I take it back to my teacher and I say, I don't know what to do. This other person you sent me to said that this final chaf might actually be erased. It's no good. He said, well, I want you to take it to this other guy. Who was like the secretary of the Belzer Rebbe in Jerusalem, in Kiryat Bel. So I went and I took this klop and I made an appointment to go to see the secretary of the Grand Rebbe. And he, we sat down and he had all of these questions about me and who I was and what I was doing, sort of, and I just wanted to know, is this letter okay? Is this a resh? Is this a chas sofit? And he looked and he said, oh, it's she'elat tinok. What does she'elat tinok means? It means it's a child's question. It's a child's question. What does that mean? It means that you are supposed to ask a child who knows their letters but not their words to take a look at the letter and say which, because if they know their words, then they will recognize, oh, that's Rishach B'chaz, that's a Chav Sofit, it's going to throw them off. So you have to ask a child who's like 3 years old or whatever, 4 years old, and they know their letters, but they don't know their words, what letter it is. It's a she'elat tinok. It's this category that's a little bit ambiguous. So I still don't have an answer, right? I've talked to 3 different people, I still don't have an answer. I go back to my teacher again. He said it's a she'elat tinok. He said it's this, so what does that mean? Is it kosher or is it not? He said it means you have to ask a child. So we took my mezuzah to a nearby preschool. My teacher had...
You can buy a kosher scroll for like $50, right?
I know you can buy a kosher scroll for $50. This was worth so much more than $50 to me. We took the scroll to a nearby preschool near his house. He had a bag of candy with him. We went into the preschool. He had asked the teacher, and we started asking kids, what letter is this? It's a resh or is this a chav sofit? The kids were like, it's a resh. And my teacher started waving the bag of candy. He said, you sure it's not a chav sofit? This is a chav sofit. I have a kosher mezuzah because these kids are like, oh yeah, it's a chav sofit. Give us the candy. This, by the way, to me is like this most incredibly beautiful story about exactly how this could, why is my mezuzah kosher? And this is the mezuzah that's on the, this is the mezuzah that's on the door of my bedroom. I had to buy a really large case to be able to accommodate this 15-centimeter cloth, because sort of these kids and sort of their purity of their excitement for the candy, like, yeah, it's a chassid. Which is, to me, I don't know. To me, that is just like a beautiful. Anyway, sorry. So that is a very, very long digression. What's that? Oh yeah. Oh my gosh, he's amazing. I'm still in regular touch with him. He's the last time I was in Israel, we ended up having Shabbat with him. He's just an amazing person, an amazing mensch. Anyway, so Vav, sorry, that was, as I said, a very long digression off of a Vav, is also in its own way, right? Just like the hey, which we said is really just the smallest sound. If Aleph is no sound, hey is the smallest sound you can make. It's breath, right? Vav and yaz, again, there's nothing with your lips. It's this sort of slightly formed, but not a very like full sound that binds things. So a vav also, it's a va. Probably think that in ancient Hebrew it might have been a wa, which is even a softer sound. And it can also become an O or an U sound, right? Depending on where dots are placed, which sort of shows how inconstant it is, right? It's not a G, and it's not a K, and it's not a T, right? It's kind of like all of those letters in God's name, sort of like this letter that's constantly in flow, so much so that it can disappear, right? If you put the dot above, you make an O sound. If you put the dot inside, you make an U sound. But you could actually remove the vav from the equation entirely. You could just have the dot without the vav, and you'll still get the O sound. It's like the vav can be entirely abstracted. Interestingly, there are almost no words in Hebrew that begin with a vav. Almost no words in Hebrew that begin with the letter vav. Meaning just sort of like the simple nouns themselves or verbs themselves, but it's a prefix. Good. It's a prefix, which is and. Conjunction, we talked about that, right? We talked about that. I'm not going to keep flipping back and forth, but to the Aleph, how it's sort of linking. It's the and, the conjunction that links the upper yod and the lower yod. But it's not also and. I mean, part of the issue, right? If any of us grew up in the King James Bible, the King James translation, one of the notable features of the King James is how many times the word and shows up. And the man knew his wife, and she bore a son, Cain, and she said, I have acquired a man from the Lord, and he knew her again, and she again bore a son, and she named him Abel. It's and. Like practically every sentence begins with and. Why? Because the translators of the King James Bible didn't know Hebrew. Vav does mean and, but it's also a grammatical marker that has this form that's called vav hahipuch in biblical Hebrew, not in modern, but in biblical Hebrew. If you put a vav in front of a past tense word, it becomes a future tense word. And if you put a vav in verb, and if you put a vav in front of a future tense verb, it becomes a Hebrew word, becomes a past tense word. So like, again, if anybody knows, depending on what your familiarity with modern Hebrew is, like yidaber means he will speak, vayidaber means he spoke. Why did putting the vav in front change it from he will speak to he spoke? Because the vav is sort of, vav hahipuch means literally the opposite. It transfers the past tense into the future, and the future into past tense, right? And the vav, and it's just a marker that does that. It doesn't mean and anymore. But the translators of the King James Bible didn't know that, right? So they knew that it would change a future tense form into a past tense verb, but they didn't realize the and went away. So they kept saying, and he did this, and he did that, and which is actually interesting because it sort of becomes one of these markers of like what biblical Hebrew sounds like. So the vav is transformative, and it can turn the future into the past, into the past, into the future, which is kind of interesting as that letter that exists sort of in the middle of God's name, because God exists out of time entirely. What?
The word you as difficult.
It's grammatically impossible, right?
Because it's past, present, future.
Right. Was, am, and will be at some level, right? No. Because that's a vav at the beginning of a word. It's because at some level you have the yud at the beginning, which if you were reading it as a verb would make something into a future form. And then you have this sort of past tense seeming form that's not exactly a past tense form. It's like you have a future prefix attached to a past. No, I mean, yes, but no. I'd like that, but it's not, right? So we also have the vav, right? It's wider at the top than at the bottom, right? So you talked about it being more grounded than the yud, but right, it's sort of indicating that there's this upper reality to which we're joined is fuller and more expansive than the narrow reality that we might be in, which is again sort of part of the way that we think about this issue about the letters and about the alphabet. I'm gonna keep moving just because it's already 8 o'clock and I got some more stuff that I want to be able to get through unless anybody has something else burning to say about the Vav. I wanted, speaking of Sofrut, speaking of the way that the letters are written in Torah. Right? I'm not actually going to say tons about this letter except for where it's written. So what letter is this? Peh, right? And this is the way that a peh is written in the Torah. And I just wanted us to be aware because there's something incredibly cool about the peh. Peh is the Hebrew word for mouth, right? And remember, we talked about sort of God speaking the world into being. Bereshit bara Elohim. In the beginning, God created the world, right? Starting with. So if we look at, what's that? Well, even open mouth, but even more than that, if we look at the negative space inside the pen, there's a bet. See how there's a bet in negative space inside the pen? A bet right there. I'm trying to do it so people on Zoom can see as well. Can you see there's a white bet inside, right, written in negative space, which is amazing. It's like the peh is God's mouth, and God's mouth is constantly speaking creation into being. Like this bet of creation of Bereshit is always in God's mouth. We talk about in the morning prayer that God is Hamechadesh b'chol yom tamid maaseh Bereshit. God is the one who renews each and every day the work of creation, Bereshit, with that bet. So it's just an amazing thing to be aware of because it's not anywhere else. It's not, you don't have this weird little part jutting out of a peh if you were just writing a peh or if you're printed a peh. But it exists in a Torah scroll when a peh is written to make sure there's always a bet inside of the peh, which just is parenthetically, I think, absolutely. Let's talk about one more letter, and we're going to sort of shift gears a little bit. What do we got here? What? Oh, I love that answer. Okay, so Laura said it's 2 Zions, and she's right, and she's not quite fully right, because when you combine the 2 Zions, you get a chet. But this is a chet. Again, not the way that we might be used to thinking of a chet being written, not the way you have it on your sheets, but the way that it appears in a Torah. Sorry, I was holding it so people on Zoom could see it too. The chet. A chet in the Torah is written by basically 2 Zions that are then connected with this tiny little, the Hebrew term is a chatoteret, which means an arch. So it's like these 2 different pieces, and they represent sort of these 2 equal but opposite forces that are united, but just barely, right? They're like, it's almost like you've got these 2 independent letters, these Zions, that are just kind of like up against each other and just barely connected and kind of balancing in opposition to each other. See what I'm saying? And there's actually, there's a fun book. It's not terribly deep, but there's a kind of a fun book called The Book of Letters by Lawrence Kushner. It's just kind of his ruminations drawn on some of these rabbinic traditions about some of these letters. And he has something kind of cool to say about that. So I just thought that would be kind of interesting to read. So he talks about the idea of these 2 Zions that are sort of these 2 letters that are kind of sort of not struggle, but they're sort of, right, they're kind of stuck up against each other. They're sort of balancing each other out. And he said the idea of sort of these 2 different things that are standing kind of uncomfortably in relationship to each other is why the word chet yields so many strange and conflicted word pairs. I don't know the bio of this, but I thought it was kind of fun, so I'd read it. Sin is chet. Chet is the word for sin. A soul torn against itself because it is sure that it is pious, while the Hasid, or pious one, is a soul convinced that it commits many sins. Pang is chevel, right, a birth pang, almost dying from birth work, bringing forth life. while life is chayim, almost dying and almost living from bringing forth life. Desecration is chilul, the secularization which knows no sanctity and can only drive souls apart, while a little group is a chavura, a small society of souls who join together to accomplish some holy task. Destruction is churban, devastation which always seems to be the end, while the marriage canopy is a chuppah, a shelter protecting the seedling of another generation. And this is why at the end of a book of the Torah and at the beginning of something difficult, we say chazak, right? Be strong. Learn from what has gone before that strength is not of might and force, but of endurance and balance. So it's a little cutesy, but I do like the idea of seeing the chet as sort of having these two letters that need to kind of be in balance with each other, and they need to be in relationship with each other. And then that creates, right? The Zion can't stand on its own. It's wobbly. It's like, it's just got this one point of connection. Neither can the other Zion, but when you connect them, we talked a little bit about yin yang last week, right? So if you have these two different points, then it has the stability, but the stability comes out of being in relationship with something, even if that's something the way he sketches out is its opposite, Roger.
Is there any, significance here that Zion, the little baby weapon, and then it has the set. So you have two weapons, and it's like two warring factions, and in order to keep balance.
So Roger, for those on Zoom, was asking, looking at the sheet that I'd given out last week, that Zion, right, literally means weapon. It's worth pointing out by analogy that in modern Hebrew it also means penis. Not a coincidence. What's that? Okay. Oh yeah, Stacey, I never asked you to show me the yud thing. I'm sorry, you went to get that and. Okay, I'm sorry, because you went and you grabbed. All right, I'm still curious to understand what you're talking about. And so anyway, Roger said Zion means weapon and chet means fence. Again, and sort of in their original whatever. And you need a fence between people maybe who have weapons. I don't know. Right. I think that's what Roger was saying, right? That the letter is this thing, sort of the weapon is this thing that's maybe offensive, and the fence might be this thing that's defensive, and sort of the weapon is aggressive and active, and and the fence is this sort of more passive barrier, but is able to. I don't know. Play with that. I like it, and I'm not sure. I mean, again, according to this approach, right, Roger. Everything is in there, right? If you see something there, it's there. It's then just a question to be able to figure out what it is. Whatever your theory is, you can kind of squeeze it, right? So, chet, by the way, if you're looking down through that, you still have that sheet. It's the 8th letter, and so it kind of stands for the number 8, which is a very interesting number in Judaism, because 7, as we're aware, is kind of like a complete cycle, right? You've got the 7 days of the week and the 7 days of creation, and 8 is kind of the sort of, so like if 7 is a complete cycle, 8 is what's that? Both. The best way, honestly, to think about that at some level is if you think about a musical scale, which actually has 7 notes. Da, 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 da. And then you have an 8th note, da, which is the same note as the bottom note, but it's not obviously in the same place and it's doing something different. So it's kind of like starting another cycle over, but at another place. And so the way the rabbinic imagination understands the letter 8 is if God's creation is complete in 7, 7 is this symbol for the completion of God's creation, then 8 is where human beings interact with that creation, right? God does it through 7, and then in 8, that's where human beings come and interact with that 7, with whatever God has created, in order to be able to sort of make something new and complete it, right? So there are a lot of, an example of that. Circumcision, exactly, right? Sort of the human body as it comes out, in this case, a boy's body, right, is 7. It's sort of complete as it is, but then human beings on the 8th day, right, take a Jewish baby boy and circumcise it, right, in order to sort of humans working with God to complete and finish something. It's sort of like the next stage beyond God's creation. Right. Well, that's 8, and that's an English character. And English characters, we know, of course, have absolutely no significance or independent existence, unlike Hebrew characters. So you don't get to drosh the English letters, only Hebrew letters. Right, an animal is only fit for sacrifice on the 8th day of its life, right? So for the first 7 days, it's kind of in this God's realm, and then on the 8th day, it comes into humans' realm. Hanukkah, the dedication, right, is 8 days long. It's like sort of the temple is dedicated for 7 days, and then on the 8th day, that's when human beings are able to go in and start using it. So I'm mentioning all of this just by way of segueing us into gematria, which is something that I imagine that we're familiar with, or we might be somewhat familiar with. The idea that each of the letters traditionally also has a numerical value. I have another handout that has some of that. And this time I actually got my act together to put it into the chat. So here you guys go for the handout for those on Zoom. Right, so you have a list there of, you've got numbers running down your other list that represent by number of letters. But then we've also got this that talks about the numerical value, the gematria value, right? Because each of these letters also has some kind of numerical value. And by the way, this was not something, I should say, that was unique to the rabbis. The ancient Babylonians did something similar, where they had sort of numerological equivalents to letters, but sort of in this idea, in this sort of within this framework that the rabbis were laying out about how they thought about letters, and how they thought about how they sort of represented the deep pattern, the deep, substance of existence. It was a way of saying that different words whose letters added up to the same letters, same values, numerological values, were equivalent, right? Just the way that certain analogous chemical compounds have certain similar qualities. Or if you're looking at a periodic table, I keep coming back to elements in chemistry and physics. Like if you look at a periodical table, it's set up in such a way that right, elements in the same column often have similar qualities, right? So it's kind of a way of saying, right, there's a relation within those cycles of how these things connect. And so similarly, there's kind of an analogy between the numeral. Are you guys able to open the handout that I gave you? Did that work? Great.
Yeah, I have a question though. Where did the actual initial assignment of the numbers to the letters come from?
Where did the initial assignment? I don't know. I mean, it's a better question than I have an answer for. Obviously, the first 10 numbers correspond to the first 10 letters.
Right.
And then there wasn't really a need for an 11. So you'd go up, a place to 20 and to 30 and to 40, and then you can get all the way up because you're operating in base 10. You can only get up as far as 400. There are ways, by the way, there are other systems of gematria besides besides the one that we're most familiar with, which we have here. There's one called Mispar Hagadol, which means sort of the larger numbers, which counts the final letters as well and gives them their own numerological equivalents, right? When I say there are 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet, that's treating the final letter as being the same as the which we see here, right? There, you've got the final letter of the kaf or the mem or in the nun in the same square as the regular letter. But there are other ones that you can even sort of spell out the names of the letters in order to be able to get fuller and more expanded gematria. So I want to be clear. Gematria is, I think, cutesy. I don't think it really does too much for us, but it can be fun to be able to explore some of the meanings that it gives us. And from the perspective that the rabbis have of saying, right, each of these letters have their own independent existence and properties and whatever, right? So it is interesting to think about the fact that, right, that you would say all of the elements in the right-hand-most column of a periodic table have the same, the same properties. They're all noble gases or whatever, right? The ones on the left-hand side are all -1 or whatever. I'm sorry, it's been a while since I took chemistry. So the idea of being able to say, well, maybe we can play around to be able to sort of make connections. And so there's all kinds of interesting things that the rabbis do with this, which I want to be clear, at the end of the day, I think are just kind of cutesy, but I didn't think that we could really talk about the letters in the Hebrew alphabet without actually talking about the numbers that come from it. So how does the gematria work? Well, in some cases, it can be just making a connection between two words that have the same numerological equivalent. So for example, the word echad, anybody want to do some quick math to figure out what the numerological equivalent of echad, aleph, chet, daled is? I'm going to get a little more than 10. That's a hey would take us. Yeah, right. Aleph is 1. Chet, we already said, is 8. Dalet is 4. 1 plus 8 plus 4 is 13. So echad, which means 1, has the numerological value 13.
So that's the 13 attributes? Oh, I forgot. God is 1 with 13 attributes?
1 and the 13 attributes. And what else do we say God is? We say God is love. Love in Hebrew?
Ahava.
Ahava. Numerological equivalent of ahava? 13. Aleph is 1 plus hey is 5 is 6, right? Plus vav, right? Yeah, right? Plus hey, 8, 13, right? So it's kind of fun. Is that really doing anything for us? I don't really think so, but it's kind of fun to say that basically, right? Echad, God, right? God is 1. God is love, and 1 and love are the same thing. That, by the way, that same gematria is also used to talk about two people who fall in love, and instead of being two separate people, create one new whole. So ahava turns into echad. It can take two people and turn them into echad through that 13. Another example that plays around with that is
Something to do after you finish the Sudoku puzzle.
say again, Karen?
Something to do after you finish the Sudoku puzzle.
Something after you finish the Sudoku. Yeah. Again, I am not terribly bought into this, but I figured we'd spend a couple of minutes to.
It's fun.
It's something to do after you finish your Sudoku. Yayin, wine, has a value of 70. So does the word sod, which means secret. Right? When the wine goes in, the secrets come out, which it also says in the Talmud. Interestingly, Av, father, has a value of 3. Aim, mother, has 41. You bring a father and a mother together, you get a yeled, a child, which has 44, right? The father and the mother make the child. More interestingly than that, just because I don't think those are terribly whatever, but there's some more gematria, which I think is kind of that the rabbis actually do use to try to learn things from, because those are just like parlor tricks at some level, right? So what is, to my mind at least, kind of a deeper level of gematria? So there's gematria that the rabbis use, for example, to be able to, in order to be able to, to drash, to be able to understand things in the Torah. For example, how long do the Israelites spend in Egypt in slavery? The number that we get is 210 years. And that number 210 isn't actually stated anywhere explicitly in the Torah. The rabbis end up sort of calculating this happened and this happened and that, and then they go back and they calculate it's 210 years. But they go and look at the fact that when Jacob isn't sure whether he should go down to Egypt at the end, when Joseph sends for him and brings and says, come down, and then God says, no, go down to Egypt, Redu, go to Egypt, Reish Daled Vav, you add Reish Daled Vav, you get 210, right? So that God's instruction to go down to Egypt includes encoded within it 210, that point to the 210 years that the Israelites will be slaves in Egypt. A really weird one, and I actually like this one because there's honestly nothing else to do with this. In Parshat Lech Lecha, Abraham's nephew Lot is kidnapped by the king of Sodom. And Abraham goes to try to rescue his nephew. And the Torah tells us in Genesis chapter 14 that Abraham takes with him 318 men. 318 men. It's what he had, sure. It's a really weirdly specific number, I think you'd agree, right? And the Torah could just say it took a lot of men or more than 300, 380. It's a little weird. Right? What do the rabbis do with that? They know that Abraham has this servant named Eliezer. Anybody want to guess what the gematria equivalent of Eliezer is? Excellent. You did that so quickly, Mark. And so they say that Eliezer was sort of so powerful and mighty because he feared God, that he was the one that Abraham was able to send as the entire force in order to be able to go and rescue Lot from there. Again, does this mean? It's kind of a cool thing that there's this really bizarrely specific, right, 318, and the rabbis, are able to connect this with Eliezer. But what I wanted to say, and we may actually even end with this thing. I'm not going to want to dive into something new when we've got 5 minutes to go, is we looked at this Aleph last time, right? And we said it was 2 yods and a vav. So anybody wanna do that math? 26, terrific. Right, so this Aleph, which begins one of God's name, and we said is like a letter that's associated with God, Elohim, right? Has this value of 26 if you break up its components. The name of God, Yud He Vav He, is 26, right? So it's a way of kind of saying these 2 main names of God, Adonai and Elohim, are in fact connected at this deeper level because, both of them, they seem like separate names, but actually they're both connected through this number 26, which is a way of saying, which is that echad plus ahava, right? We said love is 13 and oneness is 13, and you add those 2 together to get a fuller sense of God is 26. And you see how you can start playing around with this, right? You can see how you could start having some serious kind of fun with thinking about this way. And that idea of saying, oh, these 2 things seem like they're separate, but if we look at them at this other level, if we use this kind of code, this numerological code, in order to be able to tease them apart, we see that actually they're not separate. They're all connected, which is part of what I was saying before about the fire or about the ocean. We see these separate manifestations, these separate expressions of this larger whole, because that's what we're able to relate to. But if we could see it down at this deeper level, we would recognize how it's all interconnected. Not only is it interconnected, it's actually all one. It's sort of our conceptual mistake that we see these things as separate. So we see these two different names of God and say, they're two different names of God. They're not. They're all one name of God. They're all sort of connected there. Speaking of names, by the way, I wanted to get everybody's Hebrew name or Yiddish. Do you know what it is? So I don't want to read with your parents. I'm just looking for your own names. So, if you're, I'm Yehoshua, right? So if you don't have to write it in Hebrew, you can write it in English, whatever it is. And because I have some stuff that I want to do with their names. And so that goes for those of you on Zoom as well. If you want to type your Hebrew names into the chat, again, it doesn't need to be in Hebrew characters. It also doesn't need to be Hebrew. It could be Yiddish. And you want to put those into the chat. I have some things that I want to show us about names because names are also. What's that? If you have a Hebrew would be better if you have a Hebrew. And I'm sorry. I should have also said I need your English name too, just so I know who you are. I do need your English name, so I'm able to. So Janet and Susan and Brenda and Lisa and Karen and Judy. I don't know if you're there. To type your okay. Okay, I'm getting some names here. Okay, don't worry about the spelling. That doesn't matter.
I do not have a Jewish name.
Okay, terrific.
Somewhere, somebody made one up. I have no idea what it is.
Well, we could do something about that,
We have to talk about that, privately. I'm very serious about that.
Okay, well, so am I. We'd be happy to do it. Because I need to have this information for something that I want us to be able to do with it for next time. We have our last class meeting next week on the 29th. So we have, there's a lot more still to be able to speak about, but I hope that we were able to sort of extend and deepen some of the things that we talked about in the first week. I hope for those of you who weren't here last week, it wasn't too confusing to be able to sort of jump into that way of thinking about things. And we're gonna wrap up with some other things on our third and final week. Any closing thoughts or questions for tonight? Stacy? So Stacy said these these connections, right, of sort of creating the alphabet and creating the numbers, right? It's pretty clever, and you got to do a lot of work to be. I'm sorry, am I tapped? So I want to point out that from the perspective of like the early rabbis or Sefer HaYetzirah, right? None of this was human created. None of this was human created, right? Of course it was. But from their perspective, from a mystical perspective, it wasn't human created. God created the letters. And then people sort of discerned their numerological equivalents, not so different from, not counting elements that are created in scientific laboratories, right? There are these elements and they have, they exist. And then human beings were able to go in and discern their qualities. It wasn't that human beings invented their qualities. It wasn't that human beings invented that hydrogen has 1 proton and and helium has 2 and boron has 3, and help me out here because I'm running out of yeah, whatever. Right. The point is, right, that these things have their own independent existence, and then human beings who studied them ended up discerning aspects of them. And then once human beings discovered aspects about them, they were able to then make use of that, right? If you understand, here's how carbon functions, you can take advantage of that and you can manipulate that. And you also know that something with carbon and hydrogen and oxygen is going to have these qualities, this, that, right? Whatever it might be, right? So it's like human beings are able to make use of that information once we have it, but we don't create it. And that's not so different from the ways that the rabbis would say about this, right? That God creates all of this, and then we discern the qualities and the characteristics that God implanted into letters, and then based on that, we can use that to understand new things and figure out how to create new things, just the way that rabbis can create and synthesize, scientists, can synthesize new molecules or whatever in a laboratory and understand sort of some of the qualities they might have. You're trying to create a new drug or whatever, what's likely to work and how you manipulate it, because they understand how it works at a deep level. That's similar to the way that the rabbis might think about this one. Yeah.
So modern that you don't need to pray with words, you can pray with heart, sing the same la la la, and it's got very scriptural eyes. Okay. The rabbis in this period, you need.
Matt asked a great question, because taking this obviously to the realm of prayer, and we talked about at the very beginning of the first class, right, that words are the place sort of for Jews, that one of the places that we encounter God, right? Words of prayer, words of Torah, right? Studying, it's sort of where we encounter God. We speak to God, God speaks to us. And so Matt is asking, does that suggest that at least from this approach, you actually need, are you okay? Oh, no, I thought you were like smashing a bug or something. A specific, do you need these specific words in order to be able for your prayers to be correct, or do you is it sufficient to be able to sort of think about it? And it's a great question, because you're right, this does kind of suggest that they need to be very specific words. And actually the rabbis of this time period, it was a little bit in flux. If you look in the Talmud, you'll see that there are debates about how prayers worked, and you'll see it's very clear that there were different prayer leaders who would kind of, I won't say make up, but would sort of riff on certain themes in order to be able to make their own prayers. But then the closing line of each prayer, Baruch Ata Adonai, right? Yotzer HaMeorot, who creates the heavenly light. So Heva Amo Yisrael, who loves your people Israel, right? Whatever it might be. Was supposed to kind of be fixed. So there actually was a little bit of a tension between what's the creative piece and what's the fixed piece. It's interesting to think about actually the way that Maimonides thinks about the difference between the Shema and the Amidah, which are sort of like these two central parts of prayer, with one really, really, really important difference. Shema is words of Torah, right? You're just quoting passages from Deuteronomy and a little bit from Numbers. The Amidah are words of prayer which were kind of humanly created, and how much more important it is to be able to have the proper kavanah when you're saying these words of Torah, because words of Torah are words that come from God, and words of prayer. So, for the rabbis, there is a tension, right? The Zohar says, Rachmana liba baye, God wants our hearts. That's what God wants. God wants our intention. But it's difficult to figure out sometimes how to express that intention. Our intention needs some kind of vessel, some kind of vehicle to be able to carry it forward and to make it, to bring it into existence. And so words do have that function. That's a whole other adult ed in and of itself about the relationship between. I'm sorry, I'm also trying to write down the Hebrew names as I'm going. Between keva, which is structure or form, and kavanah, which is intention. So there's a lot of stuff to be able to say there. All of which is to say that there isn't one terrific, it's not that much of an either or, but you'd like to fit that maybe into some kind of dichotomy, some kind of binary, but I guess we're in the realm of resisting binaries right now. Susan Sorkin asks, is the pronunciation of Hebrew consistent from country to country? Depends by what you mean by how consistent it is. I mean, obviously, the way an American would say something in Hebrew sounds different from the way an Israeli would say something in Hebrew. It's not that the word, and by the way, Yemenite Hebrew, Hebrew spoken by the Jews of Yemen, preserves all kinds of distinctions between different letters that nobody else has anymore. So for example, right, we know that a pay with a dot in it is pronounced differently from a fay, right? A letter pay without a dot in it, or a bet with a dot in it is a bud, without it is a va. Like Yemenite Hebrew preserves the distinction of a gimel with a dot in it, or a gimel without a dot, or some other letters as well. So it's not 100% consistent the way it's pronounced. But again, remember, the pronunciation isn't really the piece that's kind of the main part of that here right now. Kind of the main part is the way it's written, because that's the thing that's sort of easier to fix and easier to freeze. Was there somewhere you were going with that, Susan? You're muted, so I can't quite.
I was just interested in.
Yeah, no. So the answer is no. There is some difference, and Yemenite Hebrew is particularly.
Excuse me, I just want to say, because before what you were saying about, you were showing the letter, the V, and you said it might have been a W originally. And then I was thinking of the Yiddish, the V and the W being interchangeable.
Right.
Just that's all. So my mind goes in different
And
directions.
let's also remember that if we talk about the Yiddish, right? Sort of there's the Ashkenazi pronunciation that turns a taf without a dot into a sa, right? So Shabbat becomes Shabbos, and Sukkot becomes Sukkos, right? And so Ashkenazi Hebrew preserves the difference between a taf with a dot and a taf without a dot, because if it has a dot, it's a ta, and it's without a dot, it's a sa. Yeah. No, the answer is clearly there are, and it sort of lies outside of the scope of the class, first of all, because I'm not really a particular expert on that, but also because, again, what we're dealing with is the written form, which is a way to be able to sort of, okay.
Let's say the word
Rishon, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Right. Again, pronunciation is gonna, right. They're getting at the same thing, but it's gonna be pronounced differently. It's the same word, but it's like it's a very different accent. So sure. Right. Torah. Well, it's funny because you're saying Torah. That's an American thing. The Ashkenazi thing would be Torah, and in Israel it'd say Torah. Right? So you're getting like these three very different looks at the exact same word. Yeah, sure. Yeah, absolutely. The ayin, so actually it's interesting. Right. So actually, one of the things that's really interesting to be able to play around with that. Right. So the Gaza Strip in Hebrew is Aza, spelled with an ayin. So where did that G come from? Why do we call it Gaza Strip? Well, because it's spelled with a gamma, which is a Greek letter G, in the Septuagint, which is the translation of the Bible into Greek in the 2nd century before the Common Era. And one of the things that's fascinating about that is because Hebrew words, like names, are transliterated into Greek, it sort of gives us a snapshot of what Hebrew might have been pronounced like at that time. And there are ayins that are consistently transliterated as g sounds into Greek, which suggests that an ayin at that time was pronounced as a g, and that when Americans say Gaza, and Hebrews say Gaza is actually probably the more, closer to what the pronunciation was 2,500 years ago. I don't know that that's what's going on there. I don't know that Yaakov becoming Yankel is reflecting something that's going on there. I think it's more reflecting Eastern European diminutives, which were, because you have that all through the different Eastern European languages where you have diminutive forms of a name. So, all right. It is 8:40. I think we're gonna wrap things up. Thank you all for coming. We've got our last class next week. I hope everybody has a wonderful Thanksgiving. Stacey, you're not forgetting your coat and everything, right? Okay. Hope everybody has a wonderful Thanksgiving, however and wherever you're celebrating. Susan Sorkin says,
Same
like
to you.
Aleph bet, right? Right, alphabet, alpha beta, the Greek. So, all right, terrific. Thank you, everybody. Good to see you on Zoom. Hope I will see you.
You.
Happy Thanksgiving. Well, thank you, Rabbi.
Happy Thanksgiving, everybody.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Food for thought.
Everybody,
Bye-bye.
Bye, Susan.
Thanksgiving, be healthy.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Janet, feel better. Oh, she's asleep.
Can
It's
you
time to go to
hear me
school.
okay? Are
Time to
you
go
able
to
to hear me? Okay. So I apologize because we don't have our